Professor Mark Howden is the Australian National University's Director of their Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. He's a climatologist, and Mark, you've had a hand in the International Panel on Climate Change report that was released overnight.
Good morning, Ricky. Yes, I have been involved in it from the start when we started to scope that out. So, quite involved.
Yeah, and the report is one I've heard the Australian Conservation Foundation saying this morning is the last that will be released until 2030. Is that actually accurate, or is there going to be more updates between now and in the next 7 years' time?
It's the last report of this IPCC cycle, so this is the sixth assessment cycle. There'll be elections for new positions in July of this year, and then the next cycle will start, and there will be reports probably from around about 2024 coming through from that next cycle. The first of those reports is a special report on cities and urban systems.
And all right, so that's good to know. Look, just in terms of the general message of this, I mean, why was the synthesis report done? And in short, what is it telling us about our climate?
Well, to some extent, because it's a synthesis report drawing on previous 6 reports, it covers some of the same ground. So it tells us that our climate is changing, that those changes are very significant and having impacts globally. But also it points out that people are taking action in response to that. So they're both adapting to those changes they're seeing, but also reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Considerably beyond what they would have otherwise occurred. So our emissions are still going up, but they're going up less than they would if we hadn't been started to reduce those emissions through emission reduction activities like renewables. It has a lot of other information in there. So, for example, it looks at how effective climate adaptation is so far, and it's a mixed message. Sometimes it's good and sometimes not so well done. It also looks at greenhouse gas emission reduction, and it identifies there's lots and lots of cost-effective options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it's just a matter of putting them in place. And lastly, I think it comes up with an assessment of the economics of climate change, which shows that reducing our emissions significantly and keeping below 2 degrees means there's a lot more benefit than there is cost. So the economic rationale for taking significant rapid action on climate change is very strong. And that's even without taking into account climate change impacts such as, damage to our coral reefs or co-benefits from emission reduction such as improved air quality and reduced air pollution.
Well, some of those economic steps are being taken by our farmers in our regional broadcast areas. We don't have a lot of coal and gas extraction where rebroadcast, but a whole lot of farming. And I do note one paragraph in the report claims that overall agricultural productivity has increased, but climate change has slowed that growth in the last 50 years. But they do highlight, whilst there's negative impacts in mid and low latitude regions like ours, they say in high latitude regions there's actually been positive impacts from climate change.
Yeah, so the particular studies that they're drawing on there do actually show that if you're in parts of, say, the old USSR or in Canada, climate change is on net bringing benefits. But pretty much everywhere else across the globe is actually going backwards from climate change. As you point out, whilst our productivity is going up, it's going up much less quickly than it would have otherwise in the absence of climate change. So climate change is acting as a brake on productivity increases, and that's particularly around the tropics and subtropics across the globe.
Yeah, and that's something we've certainly noticed in our agricultural commentary with this war between Russia and the Ukraine. There's a whole lot of interest because Ukraine is now a major source of a lot of agricultural product. But I do note that your colleague, Professor Frank Giotso, did highlight in a statement that farmers would need to do something to address their emissions from agriculture. What are those emissions, and are farmers in Australia already taking some of that action?
So when we look at a global level, agriculture and food generates roughly 29% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is almost exactly the same number as our electricity systems generate, both globally and nationally. So it's actually a big player in terms of greenhouse emissions. And so clearly as a significant emitter, that sector needs to take action to reduce emissions. Because a lot of those emissions come from methane rather than carbon dioxide, the goal is not necessarily to go down to net zero. So with carbon dioxide, we have to actually take net emissions down to net zero to put a brake on climate change. But for some gases like methane and nitrous oxide, which tend to come from agriculture, we need to reduce by around about 50 to 60% in the case of methane and around about 30 to 40% in the case of nitrous oxide. So we have some technologies which can take us down the pathway to those sorts of emission reductions, but they're not financially viable. They've got animal health issues and various other things. And so we haven't necessarily got the tools in the toolkit yet to actually enable farmers to do that share of the emission reductions.
Now, when I look at methane you're talking about there, is it principally from livestock, or are we also talking about fertilisers? You mentioned nitrous oxide as well. There's been some commentary about, and in fact some protests in the European area about restricting how fertilisers are applied on farms because of their contribution to climate change.
Yeah, well, this is particularly in countries like the Netherlands, where they have big nitrogen issues. Like, they put on hundreds of kilos a hectare, whereas often Australian farmers are putting on, some tens of kilos per hectare of nitrogen. So it's a very different situation. And of course, in the Netherlands, they've got massive groundwater, because it's very low to sea level, and so there's build-up of nitrates in their groundwater. So there's very, very strong reasons why they should actually be reducing unnecessary nitrogen application. One of the things that's happened in Europe is, for a long time, they've actually included what we call inhibitors, denitrification inhibitors, in their fertiliser mixes, and so that actually reduces the amount of nitrous oxide that is produced when you apply fertiliser. In Australia, we tend not to use those for financial reasons, but that's one of the tools that we have got in the toolkit if we wanted to use it.
And I guess lastly, does the IPCC does mention food security in the report? Where is the balancing act there about ensuring we do meet a global food demand with a growing global population versus, I guess, what we need to do longer term to look after the climate?
So a really good question. So if we think about basic human needs, we all need, good food, good water, shelter over our heads. And so we should be prioritising some of those sectors that provide that, and then looking at some of the sectors which provide, less absolutely necessary sort of services to us as humans. And that tells us something. We actually have to prioritise reducing our fossil fuel emissions from things like electricity, from transport, and we know how to do that. We can roll out incredibly cheaply now renewable electricity, including storage. It's the cheapest energy in the history of humankind. That's the assessment which has been done, and we just need to accelerate that, and we need to accelerate lots of other ways of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, like using gas for heating houses. Is much more effective to use electricity, much lower cost. So we need to be shifting away from those high emission activities into low emission activities, and making sure that some of those absolutely critical things like good food, good water, and good housing are actually maintained so that we can actually have good lives.
Professor Mark Howden is a climatologist at the Australian National University. Thanks so much for your time. Look forward to chatting again soon.
Absolute pleasure. Have a great day.